Hello and welcome to my 500th subscribers special. In order to celebrate such a momentous occasion for this community, and given that my specialty is ancient history, today I'll be guiding you around the world as it was all the way back in 500 BC. I'll be covering as many of the cultures and states around then as I can, but because of time constraints I wasn't able to get to every corner of the globe, unfortunately, so I'm sorry in advance if I don't cover your region. But in this particular video, I'm only going to cover what was going on in Egypt around 500 BC. Enjoy. Alrighty then, since this channel is devoted to ancient Egypt, let's start our journey there. In 525 BC, Cambyses II, great king of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, conquered Egypt and condemned its pharaoh, Psamtik III, to death by making him drink bull's blood. He also proceeded to desecrate Egypt's temples and, according to Herodotus, even murdered the sacred Apis bull in Memphis, which the Egyptians thought was an earthly manifestation of the creator god Ptah. In conquering Egypt, Cambyses inaugurated Egypt's first period of Persian occupation, also referred to as the 27th dynasty, which would only come to a close over a century later in 404 BC, when Egypt became independent for the final time until the modern age. Cambyses died while traveling back to Persia, and after a bit of confusion, which I'll speak more about when we get to Persia, the nobleman who had accompanied Cambyses in Egypt as his personal spear carrier ultimately became the ruler of the Persian Empire. His name was Darius the First, and despite Egypt just being one corner of his immense domain, he would have a huge, often forgotten impact on it. But even though he did visit Egypt multiple times, he was rarely there in person. That job went to the first Achaemenid satrap or governor of Egypt, a man called Ariandes. He would have been its satrap in the year 500 BC, as he was pretty much in office from 525 to 496. I say pretty much because he had been overthrown in 522 by an Egyptian rebel referred to as Pedubastis III. But he wouldn't be in power for long, as Darius the First personally quelled the revolt of Pedubastis in 518, along with a series of other revolts he had to mop up at the beginning of his reign, and he reinstated Ariandes as satrap. According to the fourth book of the first ever historian, Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BC, so shortly after this, Ariandes got up to various shenanigans while Darius went away again. As such, when Darius traveled back to Egypt in order to inaugurate the opening of a canal connecting the Nile Delta to the Red Sea in 497 or 496, Ariandes was put to death. Herodotus states that when Ariandes learned that Darius intended to leave a memorial surpassing anything other kings had left, Ariandes did likewise and was punished for it. In addition, the reasons Herodotus gives for Ariandes' execution include him making himself equal to the king and minting his own extremely pure silver coins, which of course would have been minted around the year 500. Herodotus even explicitly added that no silver money was as pure as that of Ariandes. But Herodotus also explicitly claimed that this wasn't the reason he was put to death, and that instead he was executed for rebellion. But given that none of these coins have been identified yet, and because coined money wasn't even used in the province of Egypt at the time, and all imported silver coins were treated as bullion, scholars have doubted whether Ariandes ever minted any coins. There also would have been no need to make his silver so pure, because the demand for silver in Egypt primarily came from its silversmiths, who wouldn't have wanted to work with such pure silver. Assuming they were real, it would have been a waste of time for him to do so if he issued them at the same face value as official sigloi, a type of Persian coin intimately tied with the year 500 BC, which we'll get to later, given that the value of silver was always higher in Egypt than it was in the rest of the Middle East. Therefore, Ariandes would have gotten a better bang for his buck if his silver was bullion. But it's also possible that Ariandes did exactly that, and took advantage of the high price of silver in Egypt by acquiring official sigloi at face value and then selling them as bullion to Egypt's silversmiths in exchange for gold. He certainly could have made a pretty profit from gaming the system like that. But in the end, that might have just bit him in the ass, because such misuse of Official currency could have been another one of Darius's pretenses for executing him. So what about that canal I mentioned? Well, believe it or not, but it was actually the ancient world's version of the Suez Canal. I'm betting it would have been in the process of being dug in 500 BC if it was inaugurated in 496 too, so let's talk about it. This canal, known as the Darius Canal and the Canal of the Pharaohs, and among other things, ran from where the town of Zagazig is, in the Nile Delta today, through the Wadi Tumilat to where Suez is today. Aristotle claims that it was initially begun by a pharaoh by the name of Sesostris, one of the 12th dynasty Senusrets, who failed to complete it. Even if this wasn't the case, it was still probably begun by and was left unfinished by a pharaoh of the 26th dynasty named Necho II, who ruled a century earlier than Darius. Aristotle also mentioned that Darius the First also failed to complete the canal. They supposedly couldn't complete it because of the difference in height between the river and the sea, and because they didn't want the seawater to spoil the Nile's freshwater. The king who actually finished it The king who is said to have actually finished it was Ptolemy II, whose engineers fitted it with a water lock in order to compensate for the difference in height. But contrary to that account, Darius erected 5 monuments in the Wadi Tumilat meant to commemorate the canal's opening. They're inscribed in the various languages of his empire, which included Old Persian, Elamite, Babylonian, and of course, Egyptian hieroglyphs. The best preserved of these is a fragmentary stela in pink granite, which has been nicknamed the Chaluf stela, and it's inscribed in Old Persian. Assuming the canal was operational soon after 500 BC, it would have created a very important shipping connection between the Nile and the Red Sea, i.e. a new route from Egypt to Persia. And we know how Darius made use of this. He shipped thousands of skilled Egyptian artisans, prized Egyptian statues, and other stone objects to the sites of his building projects in Persia, like his palaces at Susa and Persepolis, which we'll talk about soon. The Egyptians working on these worked the gold and wood involved and decorated their walls, and as a result, Achaemenid architecture and reliefs have a very strong Egyptian tinge to them, wouldn't you say? I mean, look at these doorways. It's like Darius just copy-pasted temple doorways from Egypt. This is evidenced by Egyptian artifacts like amulets, scarabs, and more being found at places in Persia like Susa and Persepolis. For example, the best 3-dimensional statue ever made in the Achaemenid Empire was made in Egypt around 500 BC. Unfortunately, it's headless, but it was meant to depict Darius in Persian dress with a dagger tucked into his belt. The pleats on one side of the statue were incised in Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite cuneiform, while the other side was inscribed in hieroglyphs. The front and back of the base portray the Egyptian god Hapi, corpulent as ever, and the sides depict 24 of the peoples under Persian rule in rows, as the Egyptians used to depict their subjugated foes. But amongst those rows are representations of both Egypt and Persia itself, all subservient to Darius's will. This once stood in Susa and now sits, or rather stands, in the National Museum of Iran in Tehran. In addition, administrative seals from Iran from the time sometimes bear short texts in hieroglyphs, and there were even Egyptian advisors at Darius's court in Susa. Darius's willingness to extract Egyptian artisans from Egypt to work on his building sites in Persia may have actually led to a minor brain drain in Egypt, evidenced by public temple inscriptions and private stela and statues becoming more scarce and diminishing in quality. But that doesn't mean Darius didn't have any building projects in Egypt besides his Proto-Suez Canal. In fact, he devoted significant resources to Egypt's temples and partially built several of them, possibly because he had gone out of his way to study Egyptian theology with actual Egyptian priests, at least according to classical historian Diodorus Siculus. The most apparent example of this is the undeservedly obscure temple of Hibis in Karga Oasis, way out in the desert west of the Nile Valley, as it was rebuilt and its walls were decorated during Darius's reign. Here he's depicted in the guise of a pharaoh, complete with his own Egyptian royal titulary. Darius also built the central sanctuary within the small sandstone temple of Qasr el-Guwaida, which was later enclosed by a Roman fortress. Fragmentary reliefs and blocks from his reign also attest to building projects which once stood in Dakhla Oasis, Busiris, Karnak, and El Kab. And unlike Cambyses, Darius didn't run around killing sacred bulls. He allowed 3 Apis bulls to be interred during his reign with great fanfare under the direction of one General Amasis, who explicitly wrote that his aim was to instill respect for the Apis in his fellow countrymen and the many foreigners in Egypt at the time. Another important government official in Egypt around the year 500 BC was the treasurer and chief of works in Egypt, a man by the name of Ptahhotep. He boasted of multiplying offerings in Egypt's temples, swelling the ranks of the clergy, reintroducing sacred images to temples, and putting all writings back in their proper places, presumably something that had to be done after Cambyses' rampage. But clearly Darius was a different kind of guy. So let's explore the many accomplishments he achieved outside of Egypt during his reign by covering the Achaemenid Persian Empire. In the next video in this series on what was going on in 500 BC, which will likely be much longer, like way longer, as in the length of a documentary. It's going to be insane. So if you want to see that, make sure to like and subscribe.